so that we can get a flavor for, Tolstoy as he's reflected in his character in this book, and how he's experiencing the world, and how he's wrestling with the same meaning crisis that a lot of people in this corner are wrestling with. Quote, "Without knowing what I am and why I'm here, it's impossible for me to live. And I cannot know that, therefore I cannot live," Levin would say to himself. In infinite time, in an infinity of matter, in infinite space, a bubble organism separates itself. And that bubble holds out for a while and then bursts. And that bubble is me. This was a tormenting untruth. Good morning, Sevilla.
Good morning, John. Nice to see you.
Glad to be back. I'm excited to talk about my new favorite topic.
Excellent.
Which is Leo Tolstoy and Anna Karenina.
Okay, so John, you've been on my channel before. We had a long discussion a few months ago, and we know each other through my channel and through the ZAM meetup that we were in together, and now we're in the Lila meetup together. So,
yeah,
I'm thinking a lot about Pirsig, and you've got a lot of other interests too, and we also are interested in Peterson, the corner concerns, Pajot, Paul, all that. So you've got some things you want to talk about today involving Leo Tolstoy.
Yeah, there's no way to really, this book, Anna Karenina, is kind of in depth and scope and the breadth of the moral arguments that are presented, the philosophical arguments. We can approach it. It has the gravity of Tolstoy as a Bible, in the way that the Bible is a literary realism.
Mm-hmm.
This book is literary realism, which we walk away from with a moral sensibility of how we should be living our lives.
Yes.
And Tolstoy, like Pirsig, is a philosopher. And Tolstoy writes philosophical essays in addition to his fiction works. And the level of analysis that I'm attracted to is that what we remember from Pirsig, what we remember from Tolstoy, what we remember from the Bible are not formal academic dissertations. But Tolstoy was certainly familiar with some of the formal philosophical writers, and that Anna Karenina is a mechanism to transmit his moral landscape from Tolstoy, the author, to the populace, to the readers, the way that a parent transfers their knowledge and wisdom to their children. And so you have in Anna K, for any listener who doesn't know what the novel's about, you have two plot lines, and they function kind of like an X.
Mm-hmm.
You start out with the character Anna, who's beautiful, successful, wealthy, married, has children, is a part of society, and she falls into, I guess you'd call it moral depravity. She becomes infatuated with a young man. She commits adultery against her husband, and this propels her into a cycle of deceit. And this deceit eventually drives her into psychosis, and spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't read the novel, eventually leads with her committing suicide. And so the title character gives us one cautionary tale through the novel. And I think a lot of the discussion or the cinematic presentations of the book in film form ignore the actual second plot, which I think page by page probably takes at least equal weight, if not more, which is this character of Levin. And Levin is essentially Tolstoy. more or less autobiographical character of a wealthy landowner living in the countryside on an estate, dealing with the intricacies of farming and the relationship between the peasant classes and the aristocracy, and how all of that is tied in with morality. And so when I'm reading Anna K, in the context of our current group, Lila, where we're scratching into morality, it just stands out to me that these two guys are both finding their mechanism for transmitting moral sensibility in literary realism.
Yeah.
And that's what we remember. And that's, I think Tolstoy sold, I think there's been over 400 million copies printed in Russia. And so you look at the gravity of the impact that this, I think tying in with Peterson's assertion about the power of these stories and how these stories speak louder than any kind of rational thought. And we maybe know why, or maybe that's what this corner of the internet is struggling to figure out.
Struggling to figure out, would you say our relationship with rationality is part of the problem, or is part of our struggle?
Maybe like wrestling.
Mm-hmm.
We're wrestling with it because this corner of the internet seems to have a lot of very, very intelligent people, a lot of people who are very well educated and have a wide range of experiences and a lot of formal education and a lot of analytical thinking. Mm-hmm. And yet we're all here feeling like there's something, you know, deeper, more profound, and that it's just not accessible to us. There is no college class that you walk out of and think, man, I've got it. This gave me what I needed to know to unlock the meaning in my life. That's the theme I'm picking up on, and all of this kind of web of discussion. And Tolstoy has a quote. Let's see if I can get the page here.
And this is from Anna Karenina, because you also mentioned to me the book, The Kingdom of God. Yeah,
The Kingdom of God is Within You.
Yeah.
Is Tolstoy's final work, which is not really literary fiction, but it's
nonfiction.
Yeah, it's nonfiction. It is kind of a frustrated old man who's alienated from society, living out in the country, who feels like he has something moral on his mind. And it's a description of his observations of people's behavior, and then looking at the Sermon on the Mount.
Right.
And then looking at how we are not being honest with ourselves.
Right.
But I think I'll paraphrase rather than look up the exact quote here. But in Anna K, Tolstoy says that the truth is not accessible to man, but it's accessible to an aggregate of mankind coming together in love, and that's the church. And so I think that theme, you know, overlapping from Bishop Barron and Peugeot's work and all the discussion that we're going in the church, is that you don't get to the truth kind of by yourself by thinking, and the truth isn't necessarily the church, but that the truth is accessible when we come together in the spirit of love.
So
then revealed to us.
When you're saying the truth, you're saying the ultimate truth. You're saying not truth itself in a rational sense. You're saying the higher truth is only available to us, as Pirsig would say, in the highest echelon of the social level, which is in communion, which is what Peugeot would say.
Yeah, I'm going to read directly from the text here, just to be right. He was struck first by the thought that it is not given to man to comprehend divine truths, but it is given to an aggregate of men united by love, the church. So whatever we want to refer to as divine truths, which I think is the inquiry into morals, you know, that moral truth. So I'd like to break off and read a rather lengthy chunk of Anna K, just because there's going to be some people in the audience who have no idea what the book's about or the flavor of the book. And there's one part that reads more like a salacious story of the love affair with Anna K, and then the other, maybe less broadly known part of the story is a section like this, in which you have this character of Levin sort of struggling with his existential crisis and his figuring out how to live in the world and how to orient himself. And this, I think, is the more thrust of the book. So I'll start in page 787 in the
yeah, can you show us, what copy you have? Okay, great.
Purveer Volokhonsky, pardon my pronunciation, Volokhonsky translation. And the translation is so readable and the prose is eloquent. These thoughts wearied and tormented him now less, more strongly, but they never left him. He read and pondered, and the more he read and pondered, the further he felt himself from the goal he was pursuing. Recently in Moscow and in the country, convinced that he would not find an answer in the materialists, he reread or read for the first time Plato and Spinoza, Kant, Schelling, Hegel, and Schopenhauer, the philosophers who gave a non-materialistic explanation of life. Their thoughts seemed fruitful to him, as he was either reading or devising refutations of other teachings, especially that of the materialists. But as soon as he read or devised answers to the questions, one and the same thing always repeated itself. Following the given definitions of vague words, such as spirit, will, freedom, substance, deliberately falling into the verbal trap set for him by the philosophers or by himself, he seemed to begin to understand something. But he had only to forget the artificial train of thought and refer back from life itself to what it had satisfied him while he thought along a given line. And suddenly the whole artificial edifice would collapse like a house of cards, and it would be clear that the edifice had been made of the same words, rearranged, independent of something more important in life than reason. And then I'm going to skip down here to our character. Just I'm going to read a couple more little passages here so that we can get a flavor for, Tolstoy as he's reflected in his character in this book and how he's experiencing the world and how he's wrestling with the same meaning crisis that a lot of people in this corner are wrestling with. Quote, "Without knowing what I am and why I'm here, it's impossible for me to live. And I cannot know that, therefore I cannot live," Levin would say to himself. In infinite time, in an infinity of matter, in infinite space, a bubble organism separates itself. And that bubble holds out for a while and then bursts. And that bubble is me. This was a tormenting untruth. But it was the sole latest result of age-long labors of human thought in that direction. This was the latest belief on which all researchers of the human mind in almost all fields were built. This was the reigning conviction. And out of all other explanations, it was precisely this one that Levin himself, not knowing when or how, had involuntarily adopted as being, at any rate, the most clear. I'm going to break out of the quote here and say this is, I think, the situation that a lot of us in this corner of the internet are finding ourselves in. At some point, we went to school and somebody got us, immersed in all of this rationalist, materialist, subject-object relationship. and we just adopted it.
Mm-hmm.
And then, now we're sort of scratching our heads and kind of rubbing the sleep out of our eyes and sort of wondering, like, we didn't really consciously take all this on. We just got kind of immersed in this. And then I'll finish the quote here. But it was not only untrue, it was the cruel mockery of some evil power, evil and offensive, which was impossible to submit to. It was necessary to be delivered from this power, and deliverance was within everyone's reach. It was necessary to stop this dependence on evil. And there was one means, death. And happy in his family life, a healthy man, Levin was several times so close to suicide that he hit a rope, lest he hang himself with it. And he was afraid to go about with a rifle, lest he shoot himself. But Levin did not shoot himself or hang himself, and went on living. When Levin thought about what he was and what he lived for, he found no answer and fell into despair. But when he stopped asking himself about it, he seemed to know what he was and what he lived for, because he acted and lived firmly and definitely. Recently, he had even lived much more firmly and definitely than before. End quote. And I think that this scene just reflects kind of so much of the thrust of what people are getting out of Jonathan Peugeot. That if you are in your head and analyzing and breaking down and labeling and naming and just cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting, there's no end to that well, and there's no satisfaction at the end of that tunnel.
Mm-hmm.
What do you, when I know this kind of quote's sort of out of context and new to you, what resonates with you when you're hearing kind of Tolstoy's articulation here?
Well, I think what he seems to be saying is that if you are in that, let's just say, that bubble, that intellectual space with all these ideas, and these ideas and the meanings of these words all operate as chess pieces, as objects that you're manipulating around, and mistaking those with actual lived reality, then there's going to be a bereftitude, let's say, if that's a word. There's going to feel like the spirit is missing, let's say. You've got these objects that you're trying to make you're trying to create an analog of actual lived experience, and it falls completely short because these are intellectual concepts. So if you aren't actually tied to the other levels, I'm going to use the Pirsigian model, if you're trying to do this all in the intellectual realm and make sense of you as a real being, a real biological being embedded in the social world through these intellectual chess pieces, then you're really going to fall short. And what you have to do is stand back. And this is something I really love that Jonathan Peugeot has said. He's got this interview that he does with Rafe Kelly, who I just talked to. Really very interesting, smart person. I think he's up by your way. He's over in the Pacific Northwest. And he says, and Rafe, who's struggling, he's another struggler in this corner with the material versus the let's just say noetic, says to Peugeot, how do you actually arrive at this understanding that Christ is the greatest, that Christ is the emissary of the greatest good, that through Christ we are connected to the greatest good? And Peugeot says, I hate to tell you, but it's intuition.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what you're saying is something like this, like it's this intuition, let the intellectual concepts go, and this intuition is what guides you. Is it something like that, do you think?
I read a quote from 791. Mm-hmm. Reasoning led him into doubt and kept him from seeing what he should and should not do. Yet when he did not think, but lived, he constantly felt in his soul the presence of an infallible judge who decided which of two possible actions was better and which was worse. And whenever he did not act as he should, he felt it at once So he lived, not knowing and not seeing any possibility of knowing what he was and why he was living in the world, tormented by this ignorance to such a degree that he feared suicide, and at the same time firmly laying down his own particular definite path in life. I think that this comes back over and over. Tolstoy is just wrestling with this, and obviously at the end of this, he comes to his Christian faith, and I think it's 795, 6. Let's see here. I think it comes to Tolstoy in a conversation with a peasant, and the peasant is they're talking about sharecropping, basically, renting some property to the peasants, and Tolstoy has some property he needs to rent, and there's another landowner who rents some property, and so Tolstoy is talking to a peasant trying to figure out about the appropriate rental rate, and the peasant is explaining that the one farmer is charging way less than what Tolstoy is suggesting and what he thinks is appropriate. And he says, but how can he do that? He doesn't make money. And he says, well, that man lives for God. He's living for his soul. He's not just living to stuff his belly. And the quote here, how's that? Remembers God lives for the soul. Everybody knows how. By the truth, by God's way. People are different. Now, take even you. You wouldn't offend anybody. A new joyful feeling came over him. And the music, meaning peasant, the music's words about Phoconic, living for the soul by truth, by God's way. It was as if a host of vague but important thoughts burst from some locked up place and all rushing towards the same goal, whirled through his head, blinding him with their light. Levin has a blast of insight. There's his intuition. Just like Pajot says, he's talking to this guy about the way that you can live, about what's right. This guy lives for God. And Levin just says, all of a sudden, and in a way, this one paragraph or this one page is the metaphor for the whole book, for the reader sitting here with the book. It's like, you can look at Levin's life. You can look at Anna's life. Mm-hmm. See, there's two lives. There's two ways to go. What does your intuition tell you? And Pajot's saying, well, why don't, just look at Christ. What's your intuition? And Tolstoy obviously is a very educated man, so then he starts to question, but what about the other religions of the world? Because that's seems like a common, question that you're going to go to now that we have this sort of interconnected global consciousness where we're all aware of all these different systems. And Levin's, he's wrestling with that for a minute, and then he just goes, it's not really, okay, step back. We're in the universe. If there's a deity in the universe and Christ and the church is revealing it, if it's revealed to me through the Christian church is the mechanism for the revelation of my connection to the deity, then that's real to me. I can't, speak to how the universe speaks to other cultures or other people through the religion. So what he is doing is he's constructing a definition of belief and truth, mm-hmm. Based on that Pajot intuition. He says, all I know is some intuition in here is connecting me to something that's telling me there's truth here.
Yeah.
And how someone else is accessing the truth, I just don't. I'm not them. I don't know. I can't speak to it. It's sort of irrelevant. Mm-hmm.
Well, doesn't that also remind you of, remember, now you must have you must have seen the earlier Peterson. There was he repeated this many times, but he said, I'm remembering one particular interview that was very good about 3 years ago, or maybe even more than that, where he was. I wish I could remember it. It was one of the iconic ones before. It was even before Kathy Newman, and he says that if to know what's true, he was talking about when he was a kid, and he was a really smart kid, and he had all this knowledge, he had all this empirical, all this empirical knowledge from books and stuff. So he can make a really good argument in case, like a lawyer, and sound really smart. And he was kind of caught up in that, it was very seductive to him. And then he started to realize that he's not making an argument for the truth. He's making an argument for some other goal, some ego goal, let's just say. And then when he paid attention to his intuition, to his understanding, to his embodied, and I think the embodied part is really important, especially if we're looking at, some of these discussions we've been having about why it's important that in Christianity that the practices be embodied, that they're not just theoretical. That's where you sense in an embodied way the truth. And he said that 95% of what he was saying was bullshit, and then when he's on track, when he's speaking, when he's thinking, feeling, and speaking, and everything lines up in congruence, then that is at that moment that's true. And true, in the sense that they've been using as hamartia, hitting the mark, where everything is lined up. So that's what I'm getting out of that. And that, as you go along, you burn off what is no longer useful. I mean, like that sort of truth going along a track, rather than being fixed, like these fixed ideas that so caused Tolstoy to want to kill himself, because they are represented to him to be true, and they don't at all line up with what he believes to be true, and that leaves him, completely bereft. And it's only when he enters this realm of truth being an experience in the moment that he feels like there's some meaning.
Yeah, let me insert another quote if I can.
Sure.
The answer was given by life itself, in my knowledge of what is good and what is bad. And I did not acquire that knowledge through anything. It was given to me as it is given to everyone. Given because I could not take it from anywhere. Where did I take it from? Was it through reason that I arrived at the necessity of loving my neighbor and not throttling him? I was told it as a child, and I joyfully believed, because they told me what was in my soul. And who discovered it? Not reason. Reason discovered the struggle for existence and the law, which demands that everyone who hinders the satisfaction of my desires should be throttled. That's the conclusion of reason. Reason could not discover love for the other because it's unreasonable. Yes, pride, he said to himself, rolling over on his stomach and beginning to tie stalks of grass into a knot, trying not to break them. And here, just like Peterson, and not only the pride of reason, but the stupidity of reason, and above all, the slyness, precisely the slyness of reason, precisely the swindling of reason. And as I was reading this, I thought, man, it's just taking me right back to Pirsig and Zen and all of that, the Church of Reason, and how clever that they are, that they're just gonna, concoct, some esoteric, elaborate rationale to convince you to do what they want, do what I want you to do, live the way I want you to live, get other people to conform to my sense of reality. It's a lot about channeling and directing and constructing, and that, like Tolstoy says, the swindling.
Mm-hmm.
What they're not saying is, look in your heart. The truth is right there. I can't teach you anything because you already know. What you need to know is already there. That's the intuition. So look around the world and follow that, and you'll go right where you need to go.
So you're talking about when Pirsig tells students that, you know, which essay is the best, you know, is that what you're referring to, that one part?
Yeah, that's certainly a reflection of it, but I think it's just definitely in this specific scene where he's having them ranking the essay.
Yeah.
You know, he's not giving them any criteria or character. He's just saying, look into your soul. Yeah. Is it good? You know if it's good or not. I can't tell you. You know, I'm not going to give you there's no rubric. The rubric is right here. And so Levin, as his character arc starts out, he's a little older and he hasn't got married yet. And he's got some land, but he lives in the country, and kind of like in America, it's a little less fashionable, you know, to be a farmer in the country than to be, you know, one of the cosmopolitan elites in Moscow or Petersburg, part of the society. And he's rejected by a young woman who he's in love with when he proposes marriage, who is in love with someone younger and more handsome and more dashing than he is. But Levin sort of stays focused on his sort of more moral path, shall we say. And you see throughout this book, you know, through 825 pages or something, he's following the Petersonian advice. Mm-hmm. He's telling the truth. He's living the truth. He's doing the right thing, the best that he possibly can, of using that inner intuition and doing the right thing. And you can see the pieces build and build and build. As by the end of the life, you know, not only does he have a wife and children and good relationship with the peasants that are working, he finds inner peace and spiritual harmony and is transcendently connected with the universe and God himself.
So he overcomes his meaning crisis then?
Completely overcomes his meaning crisis. And before he meets his wife, there's an interesting, one other little thread of how the individual evolves that's woven into Levin's story. And so Levin's writing, and he's telling us that, you know, early in the book, he's writing these books about economy and kind of, it's less political, but it's more like structure of society, this like the common good, the common welfare, ways, my bright ideas for how we could reform society, sort of, and sort out all of our big problems. Mm-hmm. And as he works on himself and focuses on his own life, he realizes, I would say, that all that kind of falls away. Mm-hmm. And you see this parallel just in what is going on in this country right now, where, you know, that potent message of Peterson is, we change, we are moral, mm-hmm. Collectively, we are moral. So you find the truth in you and live by that, and together we'll find our moral center. Yeah. And Levin himself, you know, realizes once he figures out that voice is inside of him, he kind of it's hard to articulate, but he's just losing interest. He's losing interest with finishing his book and writing about the economy. And he realizes that imagine that Tolstoy had written a book about how Russia should reorganize their peasant agrarian economy in 1870. Or you write this book. And I think that was the conclusion that he reached, was that finding the truth, finding the intuition, getting yourself centered with what's really in your soul is the actual path to peace and meaning, and that coming up with this intellectual framework for the way to organize the economy wasn't going to do it.
Yeah. So it is, if Levin is the Tolstoy character, then that means that the book he's writing is The Kingdom of God is Within You. Is that correct?
Okay, are you asking, is Levin the one who's writing The Kingdom of God is Within You?
Okay, so you're talking about Tolstoy, right? You're talking about Tolstoy.
I'm saying that I'm overlapping. I guess
I think because I haven't read Anna Karenina, I'm a little confused. Yeah. So let me just move to a different. Let me just be a little clearer. So the other resource that you shared with me is The Kingdom of God is Within You, specifically chapter 5. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So let's and that book is based on that book is very inspired by Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah, he's specifically drilling in explicitly to the claim that we shall not resist not evil.
Okay, before we go into that, can I just point to, now in the Sermon on the Mount, is that remind me, is that where Consider the Lilies occurs?
I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me.
I think it does. Consider the lilies. They don't make a lot of effort, and yet they end up,
yes, that part.
Through following this more through following what you, and basically what that means is exactly what you just articulated, that through following, like non-resistance, let's say, which we're going to go into, because I'd like you to talk about that. Through non-resistance, through, let's just say, it's kind of like Tao, through following that particular path towards the good, rather than motivated towards some tangible objective goal, then that is going to lead you in the right direction. Exactly what you just described in Tolstoy, following his intuition rather than following his rationality, led him to this meaningful life rather than suicide.
Yeah, and so just take one step back for the audience, that to be clear, Levin early in the book is working on this in Anna Karenina. The character Levin is trying to write this, is digesting and working on this book of economic ideas.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Levin is working on a book, but then he wants to write a different book. He is inspired to write a different. Okay.
No,
so it is in the writing of this objective, or profit-oriented, or rational and analytic book that he understands the shortcomings of this mode of thinking.
Exactly.
That we are hypnotized into believing is the ultimate truth.
He's hypnotized to think that if he could make the right argument, that he could manifest peace on earth. Yeah.
And that is,
and then he realizes that's delusional, and actually it doesn't even feel right. And I don't have that. There's so many quotes I underlined in this book. We'd be here all day, but he talks about that transition of how, when he's trying to do something for the greater good, the thinking about it is intoxicating, but the doing of it never feels right. Always feels awkward. Never feels pure. Feels clunky. Trying to pull the levers of power and in there with the legislation. And what's great in Anna K is there's one chapter where there's an election being held, and so Levin goes to the election, and there's all these the new political party and the old political party, and all of this game playing going on, and all this strategizing of how one party's going to take. It's the most boring. It's a long, boring chapter in the book. And I thought, there's no accident that Tolstoy writes this wonderful writer who can paint an elegant picture of his dog while they're hunting birds in the countryside, and the psychology of how the dog is thinking in the hunt, that he's going to waste all these pages taking you through this tedium of this election. And then when Levin gets up to the ballot box, he actually is like kind of confused and he was like, I'm trying to hold the ballot in one hand so I remember which box I'm supposed to put it into, because he doesn't really care about these political parties. And which I think in some ways also is like a little hedge, because he's writing this in the context of 1800s Russia, and that this philosophical kind of economic, political, moral discussion, most of this writing would have been censored and is forbidden. Mm-hmm. So to avoid upsetting any possible political interests, he inserts this whole very boring chapter just to show that Levin, who's obviously Tolstoy, is kind of confused and doesn't really care about politics. And I think he put his ballot in the wrong box anyway. But I thought it was a very, very clever way of making your point. That not only is the political solution not going to bring you utopia or inner peace, that he's not involved in that discussion. He's divorcing himself right there in that chapter, letting you know that he just doesn't, that either he has two ways for peace on earth, which is to write his thesis or to discover it in his intuition. But he's never really getting in. He's steering totally clear of thinking that the machinations of a political party are going to bring him salvation.
And of course, that's what we're struggling with today, is we've got this continual battle in politics as to how restructuring, there's going to be a solution in all this restructuring. And another reason why we're having a meaning crisis is because we're mistaking restructuring society as the solution, and we're not allowing our intuition to take us to where the real solution is, which is on the individual level, and then collectively with individuals who've made quality decisions.
Can I insert another quote? Do we have time?
Absolutely. And then I'd like to go on to this clip so we can talk about the non-resistance element that we were going to talk about.
Earlier in the book, page 387, mm-hmm. Levin's talking about, quote, "It cannot be denied that the influence of classical writers is moral in the highest degree, whereas the teaching of the natural sciences is unfortunately combined with those harmful and false teachings that constitute the bane of our time. One cannot but agree that it is difficult to weigh fully all the advantages and disadvantages of both branches of learning, and the question of preference would not have been resolved so quickly and definitively if there had not been on the side of classical education that advantage that you just mentioned. It's moral, or disons les mots, let us say the word, anti-nihilistic influence." And so Levin is pointing out early on in the book that the strength of that classical education, which we've moved away from, and yes. They were moving away from them into this rational materialism, was they're giving you an amoral, nihilistic education.
Yes.
And that was a dead end.
That makes so much sense, doesn't it?
I think that feel like that's what this whole corner of the internet is about.
Isn't it weird how everyone like around here is kind of, remember in the Four Horsemen discussion, the ghost of Plato really emerged, didn't he?
Mm. Yeah.
That the desire for what they knew, the ancient Greeks and the classic education gave us, is kind of making itself known, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that at some point, nihilism from the annihilation, this is that we're on a dead end.
Yes.
And at some point, okay, so you're on a big boat and there's a hole inside the boat and you think the boat's unsinkable, and the boat starts sinking a little bit, and pretty soon the boat's vertical and it's going mm-hmm. into the water. And when you feel like, man, we're going into annihilation here, the end of annihilation. You know, that you look at the birth rates, that is annihilation. When you have
actual biological annihilation is what you're saying.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. That when I zoom out and look over the last 50 to 100 years, you saw this great blossoming of humans on the world, and all this technology and all these tools and all this information and all this capacity. But, you know, if you looked in your garden and the flowers were all deformed, all the plants were looking deformed and ugly, and they were not producing seed. You know, I think that we can look around and survey and say, something's wrong with the garden. Something is wrong here. And then, you know, you would look back at maybe something that your grandfather wrote about a beautiful garden and how to keep a beautiful garden. And you'd be looking for some clues because, you know, we're thinking like, hey, well, we kind of want to eat next year.
Beautiful analogy.
Yeah, and even that reminds me of yet another quote in the book.
John, can we go on to this, because we're going to continue the discussion. You know, we've got a lot of things to talk about. You found a treasure trove. It's wonderful.
We can't even scratch the surface.
So let's make this our first discussion. But what I'd like to do, because I want to introduce this other concept that you were talking about, because I'd like to know more about it. In our last few minutes, let's quick look at this 3-minute clip. And then I'd love to know, because you said that this is something that's really engaging you in some way.
Yeah.
I'd like to know how it is.
Before you play the clip, I want to just set up.
Yeah.
When he asked the question, pay close attention to Peterson's initial reaction before he starts to articulate. There's an initial reaction, and I feel like that is the reaction that I felt when I was reading The Kingdom of God is Within You in Tolstoy.
Okay, definitely.
I guess passive resistance or nonviolent resistance.
No, not non-resistance. It's actually, it's a one step further than nonviolence. It's like you don't even resist. That's what Tolstoy was talking about. It's from the Sermon of the Mount where Christ said, resist not evil. That was like, you don't even resist it. And so I thought that there was a metaphysics to that potentially.
Yep. Well, then I would say that you've asked me a question that I can't answer. I mean, I guess that would be in the same line as turn the other cheek. Now that's
in a way, it's actually yeah. There's some nuance there, I think.
There is because turn the other cheek means don't participate in an escalating cycle of violence, and that's reasonable, man. That if you can do that. Resist not evil. You know, when I go into the Sermon on the Mount, I go into all the individual lines and look up multiple translations and multiple interpretations and try to, and sometimes that's extremely interesting. Like, for example, when there's a line in the New Testament that's the meek shall inherit the earth. That's not the right translation.
Oh, really?
That is not what that means. That means, and it's germane to our discussion, that means those who are competent to use force but do not wield it will inherit the earth. That is a whole different issue. I would like to see exactly what resist not means. Because my suspicions are that the devil's in the details, but it's definitely a sufficiently jarring injunction to be worthy of further investigation.
Especially because I've heard you talk in the past about how futile it is to show up somewhere with a placard. That's probably a very expressed version of how resisting what you deem to be evil, just the act of resisting it alone is so useless. It's a waste of energy.
Right.
Like actual energy.
That's a very interesting take on that.
So that's why I think.
Yeah, but that's interesting, you know, because I've been thinking about continuing my, whatever you might describe it as, struggle, let's say, with the forces that are corrupting the university. You know, I thought for a long time in terms of war metaphors with regards to that. And then over the summer, when I got a bit of a break, and was able to think more clearly, or begin to think more clearly about whatever it is I might be doing, I realized that my primary role on YouTube, and perhaps publicly, is not the leader of a war against the social justice warriors. It's more like,
oh, thank God,
encouragement and education.
Yes.
With that as a side effect, let's say, and maybe
Yes.
even a concern. But if it's a war, then it's the wrong approach.
You're
Or I guess maybe you also dignify your enemy with a war.
You actually encode their power.
Right. Resistance as a waste of time. That's really useful.
Waste of
I
energy.
think you got it. You bet. You bet. Well, it has all those aspects we discussed. It has the glorification of the enemy as well.
Yes.
Because it might be far more effective to say, that whole thing is dead, here's a different way.
So tell me what impacted you so much about this clip.
Well, I think I was actually just listening to the audiobook of The Kingdom of God is Within You.
Mm-hmm.
And Tolstoy is laying out almost a legal argument of how we in the society, meaning the Orthodox Church in Russia and Christians in general, how we are kind of, to use John Vervaeke's term, bullshitting ourselves. Mm-hmm. That there's this conundrum where, okay, in the world there is evil, and if you have someone who, maybe it's easier to tell this in a story. You have a child who's abused, who grows up and starts abusing other children as an adult, right? They become a child abuser. Mm-hmm. What do you do? How do you confront this? You feel like it seems obvious to us that you confront that with force, that you would take that person away or lock them up or separate them, that you're going to resist their evil with force. And that to not resist feels fundamentally immoral. Or if you're walking down the street and someone's being attacked or raped or whatever, there's some evil, violent act happening and you have the capacity to stop it. And Christ is saying, resist not evil. And Tolstoy's taking him at his word. And he goes into, it's a rather dense text and it's tedious as he goes into case by case by case by case of writers and thinkers trying to find clever academic arguments to dismiss what Christ is actually telling you to do. Mm-hmm. He says, how about we just take him at his word? Why should we be so narcissistic to think that Christ didn't, some of the writing is, well, Christ didn't really know what he meant when he said resist not. He really meant that we should do something else. And then I think what shakes me is when I was sitting with the thrust of Tolstoy's presentation of really not resisting evil, I think that's the most challenging part of to follow Christ. I don't know how to digest it. I don't know how to make sense of it. And you can create, there's a lot of, well, okay, what we'll do is like Tolstoy points out, we'll water it down. We got to water it down. We say, oh, it's just the Sermon on the Mount, Manly P. Hall says. Sermon on the Mount is just inspirational. It's just the light at the top of the mountain, and we just point at that, but we know that we could never achieve it. But can we even believe it? Can we really, if we're looking back to the earlier part of our conversation about the intuition, if you see somebody being tormented, abused, tortured, and you have the full capacity to stop it, to resist it, to apply some force, and at the same time, you can hold in this hand to know that if you have wounded people, broken people, mentally ill people, traumatized people, that you're not going to heal people through force. And the two, it creates this cognitive dissonance that I feel like is not resolvable. And I'm sure that almost everybody you talk to, well, we can find some way to resolve that. Yeah. We'll just create it. We'll create an argument, or we'll put some words in here. But like letting go of the words and just thinking about the two very simple ideas, the capacity to just allow evil to unfold. And okay, then you put it back into a story. There's two tribes. You have one tribe which you feel is acting very moral and wholesome, and you have another tribe which we'll just call barbarians. And the barbarians are at the gate, and the barbarians are just going to lay waste to your village. Okay, I mean, if we follow Christ's imperative, then we just lay down and the barbarians just take us out. And we hope that in the witness of our just giving ourselves to the barbarians are transformed. And that is what Christ did for us. We were the barbarians. And he's even saying, take me and forgive these barbarians who are torturing me. Yeah. And if you take it seriously, it's very, very hard to hold that and to internalize it, because it feels so counter to our intuition. And he's really, I would call it, it's a big ask.
Yeah, because you're talking about sacrifice for the greater good, ultimately.
That's I think what's being presented. Yeah. Yeah, Christ is saying, well, just or particularly, I think the teaching in the Orthodox Church, which is just to look to Christ and emulate. Yeah. So we're just going to look to him and go like, well, here were all these people who were really terrible, and he was willing to just go ahead and let them kill him, and that in the letting of killing him, that you're actually conquering the power of the death itself, and you're conquering the evil by not engaging with it, not acknowledging, like you're just completely in the acceptance of your reality, rather than fighting for the good. You're just trying to sort of be good
and just see where it takes you. I mean, and that, I don't mean to, that sounds like a dismissive way of putting it. I don't mean it that way. I mean, like live this way without any desire for an outcome, and have faith in Christ that by living this way, you're going to be moved in the right direction, or that reality itself will move itself. You're participating in reality and helping this unfold in the best way possible.
Now I'll introduce something that might be a little controversial, which is, I live in Portland, Oregon. Mm-hmm. And in Portland, Oregon, this corner of the internet has a lot of people who are very woke skeptical. Yeah. But in Portland, Oregon, they want no consequences for the homeless criminal element, which is all over.
I've heard this. Is happening.
And no consequences for the rioting and the looting and the smashing and the violence. And I think that through one lens, you could say that these people are very seriously not resisting evil. And that would be the most charitable assumption, I think, that in a way, there's a lot of woke hate going on, and that this dissonance is the situation here in Portland, where when people are saying, like, you can sweep the homeless and arrest the homeless and institutionalize the criminal, drug-addled homeless, element, but in a way they are embodying. And not just don't resist the evil. Just let it be.
Let it
don't
fight. Don't whatever way it goes.
Don't fight it. Yeah. We'd like somehow trying to solve the problem And again, it's hard because it doesn't feel natural to me. That is not my natural. I mean, I live in a neighborhood where there's been a lot of chaos lately.
Yeah.
So it doesn't feel natural to say, we're just not going to resist this. Just take what you want to take. And, here, take my shirt, take my jacket, turn the cheek. It's very hard. It's very hard. But I will give credit, at least like, sort of a spiritual credit to and I don't think that maybe the people in the, we call it the woke ideology, I don't think they're arguing to let the prisoners out of jail because they read Christ's Sermon on the Mount and they believe not to resist not evil. But that code, we are in the Christian water, or like the Tom Holland, sort of, we're in the frame. So wherever they got it from, somehow these people very seriously absorbed this idea of like not resisting the evil, just letting the evil out. And I think that, with the idea, sort of a faith.
So even if they're enacting this, for example, for political gain, let's say, or political power, that there's something compelling them to do it in this way that has to do with us being embodied in the Christian morality.
I think that it is very hard to be intellectually honest and say that someone who is arguing for prison reform is trying to somehow get some political edge, because it's very hard to figure out how you would calculate some kind of political edge about letting a bunch of felons out of jail. I don't think there's a political advantage. They're rowing uphill. It would be much easier if they just ditched that and went with other things like an economic agenda that they're trying to push.
Right.
But you would, for expediency, you could just discharge with defund the police and sympathy with criminals and some of that stuff. Those are actually, like the Sermon on the Mount, those are the really, really hard to accept parts of woke ideology. And so I'm listening to Tolstoy's "The Good Kingdom of God is Within You," and I'm thinking like, well, these folks are very seriously walking the walk, and they are embodying a very hard commandment, and there are consequences, and we're seeing all these consequences in town, and they're not retreating really from mission. So it isn't. There's some intuition there, and I'm trying to be not a mentally closed loop of just.
No, I think that's I think that's good. That
okay, how do I let in this idea?
Yeah.
That is very, very challenging and not natural.
Yeah, and I think that is the struggle that we're having in general in this divisive, climate, that these uncomfortable ideas we're not willing to let in. So, I mean, and that's just a small part of what you're trying to saying. I know, but an example. All right, John, to be continued, right?
Yeah, well, I hope some of those.
Thank you so much for this really interesting topic. This is a really interesting way you wanted to go with this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I'll keep digging, and then sometime when maybe we can pick some sub slice of this that you want to dig into deeper.
Yeah, let's reconvene because there's so much going on here, and you're really onto something with this book, and with Tolstoy.
Well, I appreciate you. Have a good day.
You too, John, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you. Bye.